I've had the opportunity to share what I think is some details of what I consider to be the fascinating story of the Cairo Genizah all over the United States and Canada. It's not too often I get invited to present across the pond as we're doing now, and I'm just so glad to be able to be with you, and I'm so delighted that the story of the Cairo Genizah still gathers the audiences that it clearly has done in your case. I'm assuming that most of you already have a little bit of a knowledge of what the Cairo Genizah is, but as you know, and I'm gonna, by the way, share my screen here. And wait a minute, I gotta do it in the right way. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, I'm gonna maximize it. Please tell me if you can you still see that?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So with most audiences that aren't as enlightened as you are, when I introduce the fact that I'm speaking about the Cairo Genizah, it begs a question, obviously, and that is, of course, what's a Genizah? And as you know, we Jews are amongst the world's most inveterate word nerds, right? We study words, we dissect them, we try to wring out of them every morsel of meaning, literally and symbolically and poetically, and sometimes even numerically and pictographically. And that's because our tradition, our Jewish tradition, considers words, particularly the printed word, to be this magical tool, this little packet of information that can connect one soul to another across vast expanses of time and place. And as a result of that, our Jewish law, halakha, forbids us from disposing of our written sacred words. So if we have a Bible that gets damaged somehow, if we have a volume of Talmud whose binding falls apart, or God forbid a book should become partly burned, we're not allowed to throw it away ever. So what do we do with it if we can't use it but aren't allowed to throw it away? Well, ordinarily, as many of you know, we might bury those books, and customarily they're buried in a Jewish cemetery, if possible, near the grave of a scholar. But of course, that's not very practical to schlep a book every time a book becomes unusable, to schlep it out to the cemetery and dig a grave for it. So as often as a short-term measure, synagogues and other Jewish communities will put the damaged but unusable books in a Genizah. And as a Genizah, as you know, is sort of like a sacred document dump, right? It's a place to put these unusable but very literally indisposable works of Jewish literature. And typically over the years, what would happen is a community would let the pile in their Genizah sort of grow and stew for several years, and then periodically take the material out for burial in the cemetery. That's usually what happens, but not always. And that's where we get to the story of the Cairo Genizah. Now, when we speak of the Cairo Genizah, of course, and you may have talked about this because you've already met as a class once, is that correct?
Yeah, we met once, but we didn't do so much overall. We looked mostly at manuscripts.
Okay, fine.
So different Masoretic texts.
Okay.
Or like alternatives to Masoretic text.
Okay. So when we speak of the Cairo Genizah, we're speaking specifically of the Genizah at the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo. The Ben Ezra Synagogue was built, we believe, as early as the 8th century. It was destroyed and rebuilt in the 11th century, and it's been on that site ever since. Today, you need to monitor the news, but during the times when we can safely go to Egypt, you can go and visit the Ben Ezra Synagogue. The government now maintains it as beautifully as a tourist attraction. And for many centuries, the Genizah there was kind of hiding in plain sight. People knew it was there. They assumed it was. I mean, just, because the Ben Ezra is a synagogue. So it'll have an ark for its Torah scrolls, and it'll have beams in the walls, and it'll have a Genizah, just what synagogues have. But nobody really paid any attention to it. The first outsider to pay any attention to the Cairo Genizah was a guy who, unfortunately, we don't have any pictures of. His name was Simon von Geldern. Simon von Geldern was your typical 18th century marauding Jewish Bedouin sheikh. German Jewish Bedouin sheikh, I should say. He was a German Jew. He would travel in the Middle East. Somehow he got selected to be the head of this marauding group of Jewish Bedouins in the Middle East. He would come back periodically to Europe with wearing Middle Eastern robes and turbans and telling all kinds of adventuresome tales. Women, it would say, melted in his presence. They called him Chevalier, the knight. They called him, they had other wonderful romantic names for him. And at one point, evidently, his marauding Bedouins and he marauded their way into Cairo in about 1750, where he took a peek into the Genizah at the Ben Ezra and came out saying something to the effect of, well, it looks like there's a lot of documents there. And that's the last we heard about the Cairo Genizah for about a century. By the way, most of what we know from Simon von Geldern comes from the writings of his great nephew, the very famous poet and playwright Heinrich Heine. The next thing we hear about the Genizah is, the next time we hear about it is in the 1850s. And it's from this guy. His name is Jacob Safir. I call him Mr. Smiley because of the joyful look on his face. Maybe I should call him Rabbi Smiley. He was a rabbi, Polish born, lived in Jerusalem. He was a dealer in antiquarian Jewish manuscripts. And in 1854, he went there and he asked if he could see the Cairo Genizah. They said, oh, no, I'm sorry, sir. We can't let you see the Genizah. Why not? Well, you see, they told him, the Genizah is guarded by a serpent, and the serpent doesn't let anyone in. So he said, okay, and he left, and he came back about 5 years afterwards. And I don't know, in England, did they used to get the TV show Columbo back in the 70s? I don't know if that made its way to England.
I'm not sure, but we had it in Germany, so I'm assuming that that's probably it made it to England.
Well, this was I picture him like Columbo. If any of you have seen that, this detective who's always kind of thinking out loud. He said, I was thinking about your serpent there at the Genizah, and I was wondering, if I were to slip you a little bit of cash under the table, would that make this serpent a little bit more, shall we say, lenient in terms of who he would let in to see it? And they said, yes. As a matter of fact, I believe that would work. So he slipped them a little bit of cash, and he went up there and came out with what we believe were a few thousand manuscripts to sell to his customers out of his home base in Jerusalem. At about the same time, this man went to see the Genizah, Abraham Firkovich. In fact, there's some theory that the two of them might have met while they were in Cairo. Abraham Firkovich was a Karaite. The Karaites are a group, their heyday was in the Middle Ages in North Africa and the Middle East, and they believed that they didn't accept rabbinic authority. They tried to study the Bible directly. They said, everything that these rabbis say, we're not going to accept as having any authority. By the 19th century, their population center had moved to Crimea, and he was sent out by the Karaite community to try to document the history of their community. And he was quite the character. He was sometimes a kind of a scoundrel. If he was looking for a document that he couldn't find, he would make it himself. But he went to, he said, the Genizahs of Cairo. They believed it was mainly at the Ben Ezra. And he too came away with several thousand documents to bring back home for further study. And look at this guy. He was, again, you can see he was quite the character. And he was the basis for a later character in American cinema. I don't know if anybody can tell who, but to me, it's pretty obvious that he was King Triton in Under the Sea. Maybe without the trafe on his shoulder, though. I'm not sure. But so he too came away with several thousand documents, and the word of the Genizah in Cairo began to spread. In the 1880s, this man went to visit Cairo. Elkan Nathan Adler. He was a landsman of yours, actually. He was from England. His father and then later his brother were both chief rabbis of England. Elkan Nathan Adler was a lawyer. Actually, his father made an appearance. I just happened to come across it in a Sherlock Holmes story, because if we have any Holmes buffs among us, you'll know that Holmes's love interest was Irene Adler, and Rabbi Adler's card was right next to Irene's card in Holmes's Rolodex that Watson got at one point, and there's a reference to a Hebrew rabbi. So, but Elkan Nathan Adler was a successful lawyer, a manuscript collector, became a scholar in his own right. In the 1880s, he went there, and there were renovations going on, so things were sort of scattered around. But rumor has it that they sent him up there with a Torah cover, and they told him he could bring as many documents out as he could fit in the Torah cover, kind of like going to the candy store and putting as much candy in the bag as will fit. And he too came away with a few thousand documents. Later, in a story that I don't have time to share with you now, you'll have to read the book, but there was a whole cloak and dagger story with a shady Austrian count and Oxford University going up against Cambridge and all this. And he ended up getting the largest private collection of Jewish manuscripts in ever owned. He later he got into some financial trouble. He had to sell his collection. Most of it went to the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. A few went to my alma mater, Hebrew Union College. Rabbi Leah, are you an HUC?
No, I'm Leo Beck, but I did my first year with HEC in Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem, great, okay. And actually, I found a few of the documents that he once owned that were kind of hiding in plain sight. During the Q&A, I can share that story with you if you're interested. But the real modern story of the Cairo Genizah begins not in Cairo, actually, but it begins far closer to where you live. It began in Cambridge, May 13th, 1896. A beautiful sunny spring day in Cambridge. And that day, there was a chance encounter between two individuals that would forever transform the face of modern scholarship. One of the individuals was this man, Rabbi Solomon Schechter. Fascinating guy, born in a Hasidic home in a shtetl in Romania. As a young man, he shed the black hat of his youth, and he moved in a series of moves, both intellectually and geographically, to the West. He eventually found himself at Cambridge, where at the time he was the only Jewish faculty member at Cambridge University. And on that day, he was doing some errands on King's Parade in Cambridge, the main drag. Although my British friends kind of laugh when I use that term, main drag. I guess that's one that we don't share. But the main commercial street in Cambridge, he was doing some errands when he came across this woman here on the left, Agnes Smith Lewis. Now you may see that she shares a certain resemblance with the woman on the right here, Margaret Dunlop Gibson. And that's because these women were sisters, twin sisters, as a matter of fact, fascinating in their own right. They were born in Scotland. Their father was a prominent attorney as well. He provided them with the finest of British boarding school educations, where they accelerated particularly in languages. They were proficient between the two of them in no fewer than 14 languages before they were done. And the sisters were fiercely devoted to each other. With the exception of a few months, they lived together for their entire lives. Each of the sisters was married. Each accompanied the other on her honeymoon. Each of the husbands died after just a few years of marriage, which kind of makes me say, and except for the time that they were married, they actually shared a bedroom in their very large and spacious homes. And they too were experts in and I should have said that Solomon Schechter at this point had become an expert in analyzing old Jewish manuscripts. The sisters, they're affectionately known in Cambridge as the Gibloos, Mrs. Gibson and Mrs. Lewis, the Gibloos. They were also experts in old manuscripts. They were particularly interested in Christian manuscripts, but they also were educated enough to know of the Jewish roots of Christianity. So as Christians, they had an interest as well in old Jewish manuscripts. And by the way, when the sisters would grieve, they would travel. And I'm not talking about a weekend out to the Cotswolds here. They would take multi-continent, sometimes multi-month excursions, expeditions, often in search of old manuscripts. So for example, a few years before this, when one of their husbands died, one of the sisters said to the other, you know, I hear there are some interesting manuscripts at a monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. We should go and check them out. Well, the problem was that the manuscripts they had heard about were in Syriac, a long defunct dialect of Aramaic. And neither of the sisters was proficient in Syriac yet. This was one of the few languages they didn't know. They couldn't sign up for Syriac 101 at their local university. Why not? Because they were women, of course, and Cambridge still had a no girls allowed policy. So they did the university one step better. They hired one of the Syriac instructors at the university to come over to their home, a mansion by the name of Castlebrae, to tutor Mrs. Lewis every week for a few months in Syriac. And with a few months, she became proficient in the language. When the time came, they sailed from Portsmouth to Alexandria. They took a train from Alexandria to Cairo, from where they took a carriage to the Red Sea. They sailed across the Red Sea, whereupon they embarked on a 7-day camel schlep through the Sinai desert. And they arrived, not knowing even if they'd be welcome into this monastery, particularly as women. The monks there welcomed them in, where, to make a long story short, they found one of the oldest known Christian Bibles to exist in the world. It's a 4th century manuscript, probably the only Syriac Christian, the oldest Syriac Christian Bible in the world, at least one of the 2 oldest. So these women were nothing to sneeze at. On this day in May, Mrs. Lewis runs into Rabbi Schechter, and she says to him, Dr. Schechter, how wonderful it is to see you. You know, it's funny I should run into you today because, as you may know, my sister and I, we just returned from another voyage to the Middle East, where we purchased some manuscripts. And we've been able to identify most of them, but a few of them continue to stump us. And she didn't say stump us. She said whatever the 1890s equivalent of that was in Cambridge. And she said, we were just saying today that we should have you over sometime to see if you can help us identify that. Would you be interested in coming? And on the outside, Schechter said, why, of course, Mrs. Lewis, I would be delighted to come. On the inside, I'm sure he said, you had me a manuscript. And so they chatted for a few minutes after that. They said their farewells. Mrs. Lewis continued on her errands. Rabbi Schechter made a beeline right over to their house. Here is, actually, this is about a half to a third of their house, Castlebrae. Now it's a dormitory for the students at Cambridge University. The cars weren't parked in front of it that day in 1897, although it is said that the Gibloos had the first automobile in Cambridge. But Rabbi Schechter walked up the driveway. He knocked on the door. Either Mrs. Gibson, the other sister, or one of the 8 servants who lived in the house answered the door and showed Rabbi Schechter into the dining room, which is right behind these French doors here. Soon, Mrs. Lewis returned from her errands, and they brought out this packet of manuscripts, and Rabbi Schechter started to page through them. And he looked at the first few, and he said, well, these are from the Jerusalem Talmud. As you know, there are 2 Talmuds. The one that we study far more extensively is the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud isn't studied nearly as much, and therefore there aren't very many old manuscripts of it. He said, these might be of some value. And then he came to this manuscript, and his heart skipped a beat. And in one of the great understatements of modern day scholarship, Solomon Schechter said, and this manuscript might be of some value 2. He said, "Could I borrow this manuscript?" "Yes, Dr. Schechter, of course." "Could I publish this manuscript? If you think it would contribute to modern scholarship, Dr. Schechter, of course." And so very carefully, he packed this rattered and tattered piece of paper up into his case, and he walked out of Castlebrae, not certain, but thinking that maybe, just maybe, the piece of paper he was carrying with him represented a book, a page from a book that had last been seen almost 1,000 years earlier. He wasn't certain, but he thought that this might be a manuscript, a page from the original Hebrew of the book of Ben Ezra. Now, Ben Ezra may sound familiar to you. This is a book that is in modern Catholic Bibles. It was originally written in Hebrew, but for a variety of reasons, when it came time to decide what books, and it's a biblical era book like Proverbs, it's got wisdom, it's wisdom literature. And for a variety of reasons, when it came time to decide what books were going to go into the Hebrew Bible, Ben Ezra didn't make the cut. And in fact, it's not in Protestant Bibles either. Later, Catholic scholars identified what they saw as some Catholic theology in there, so they put it into Catholic Bibles, but the version that's in Catholic Bibles comes from later Greek translations of the original Hebrew. The last person to have reported seeing the original Hebrew of the book of Ben Ezra was the great Babylonian sage Saadia Gaon, and he died in 952, the year 952. And since then, nobody else had reported seeing a copy of the original Hebrew of Ben Ezra. And for Schechter, this was much more than of academic interest, because a few years before this, a non-Jewish scholar had written an article sort of poo-pooing the significance of the original Hebrew of Ben Ezra. It might not have even been originally in Hebrew, this guy said. If so, it wasn't very important. Schechter was all over that. He said, no, I can prove it was originally in Hebrew. Here are all the citations of it in the ancient literature, and it was important, and here's why. And they went back and forth. But of course, all of the arguments were purely theoretical because the original Hebrew of Ben Ezra had long been lost to history, or so everybody thought. And here, sitting at the Castlebrae dining room table, he sees what he thinks is a page of the original Hebrew. Schechter realizes that he's got to find a Catholic Bible to make sure that it checks out. He certainly wasn't going to have one on his rabbinic bookshelf. The Giblus they were Presbyterians. They weren't going to have one on their bookshelves. He goes to the university library, finds a Catholic Bible, opens it up, and immediately the bells and whistles started to sound in his mind. This was it. The original copy, an original page from the original Hebrew of Ben Ezra. He grabs a piece of paper, a piece of letterhead from the library, and we still have this letter. He dashes off a note to Mrs. Lewis. And here it is. This is front and back of the same page. By the way, I should tell you, all the manuscripts, all the documents I'm showing here, almost all of them, I've had a chance to hold in my hands, and I can't tell you what a thrill it was. And here you can see, just in his excitement, in his handwriting, you can see the excitement. Dear Mrs. Lewis, I think we have reason to congratulate ourselves, for the fragment I took with me represents a piece of the original Hebrew of Ecclesiasticus. By the way, that's another name for Ben Ezra, Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes, that's something else. It is the first time such a thing was discovered. Please do not yet speak about the matter till tomorrow. I'll come to you tomorrow at 11 p.m. I think he meant 11 a.m., but he was very excited to talk the matter over with you, how to make the matter known. In haste and great excitement, yours sincerely, Solomon Schechter. In other words, this is it. This is it. Don't tell anybody about it. I'll be over tomorrow morning, and we'll talk about how to make the announcement. He sends this note off. He walks home for lunch, bursts through the door, says, wife, as long as the Bible lives, my name shall not die. This was not one of Schechter's humbler moments. It turns out they couldn't wait until the next day. They went over that afternoon, and that evening they made the announcement to the late 19th century equivalent, British equivalent of scholarly blogs, these newsletters the scholars would look at. And immediately, scholars all over Europe said, the original Hebrew of Ben Sira, I wonder if we have any of that. And sure enough, within a few weeks, the librarians at the Bodleian Library in Oxford identified not only several more pages of Ben Sira, but a few of the pages that they identified were from the very same copy as the page that Schechter had identified at the Giblu's dining room table at Castlebrae. Schechter realizes he had probably heard murmurings about the Cairo Genizah. He knew that he saw that some of the Giblu's documents were labeled as having come from Fustat, which is the oldest part of Cairo. And so he knew he had to get over there to check out this Genizah. He couldn't make the arrangements to get there until late in the year, but finally in December, he gets to Cairo. He schmoozes with the lay leaders and with the local rabbis, spend a few days drinking lots of coffee and smoking lots of cigarettes with them. And finally, he gets permission in late December to go and examine the Cairo Genizah and its contents. On that day, the rabbi met him at his hotel. They rode across town. Fustat, the neighborhood where the Ben Ezra is, was pretty much in ruins at the time, but the synagogue had been recently renovated, so it was in pretty good shape. They walk into the synagogue. This is not a great picture. This was taken during some renovations in the 1990s, where this is taken from the balcony, of course. Who would have sat in the balcony at an Orthodox synagogue? As you know, it would be the women. But he walked in on the main floor. He looked around and saw this very ornate synagogue. Here's the ark over here. And he looked up under this archway here. Rabbi, can you see my cursor under that archway? Good.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Under that archway there, he saw this opening in the wall, and that was his first glimpse of the Cairo Genizah. The rabbi said, "This is Dr. Schechter. He's from England. He's a very important man. He's come to see the Genizah." The caretakers nod their head and they walk him outside. And at first he couldn't understand why, until he realized that the only way to get to the balcony, was via an external staircase over on the right here. So they went up that staircase, stepped onto the balcony, made a left and a couple of rights, and soon they're standing right underneath that opening. They put a rickety old ladder up on the wall. They hand Rabbi Schechter a lantern. They invite him to proceed. Rabbi Schechter climbs the ladder, steps into the Genizah. The first thing he's aware of is the dust, clouds of dust, old dust. Whenever he would move, it would stir up more of it. So he had to stand very still. And after a few moments, the dust clouds parted, and he couldn't believe what he saw, because there in front of him, in this attic chamber of the synagogue in Cairo, Egypt, there stood in the candlelight, basically in the lantern light, a mountain of old manuscripts. Now you have to understand, at this point, there were about 10,000 or fewer antiquarian Jewish manuscripts known to exist in the world. The pile that Schechter was looking at in the Genizah turned out to number upwards of 300,000 manuscripts. And he looked at what there was. It looked like there were some old prayer books, some Bibles. Some of the text of the Bible was different than the text as he knew it. A lot of it was in Arabic. His Arabic wasn't very strong. He'd have to put those aside for later. It looks like there was a lot of correspondence in there. And Schechter knew from that moment on, life for him was going to be different. Very calmly, he walked down the ladder. He made a nice little donation to the synagogue. They told him he could take whatever he wanted. To them, it was just their old junk. Problem, of course, was that he wanted it all. But he hired some assistants to come in and help him pack up what he later estimated to be 100,000 manuscripts to ship back to Cambridge for further study. Turns out his count was way off. The real number was closer to 190,000 manuscripts. While he was there, the Giblus happened to be in town. They paid him a visit, and they had brought a camera along to take pictures of the Genizah, but a fancy new camera, but they happened to leave it in their hotel that day. So there were no usable photographs of the Cairo Genizah for more than a century after that. We'll get to that a little bit later. So Schechter gets back to Cambridge, and they set him up in a room in the library. And from this picture, this is a famous picture, you may have seen it already, actually. You can see the chaos and the magnitude of what he was dealing with. This was a posed picture. The first thing he did when he got back was to hire some assistants to help him sort of go through this stuff. One person to do the rabbinic material, somebody to do the Arabic, the Giblus to do the Syriac, of course, and several other, really top-notch scholars to help him with this. Here you see the story of the lone scholar. Well, what did they find? Turns out they found a lot. For example, this is called the Damascus document. It's one of the documents that Solomon Schechter studied himself. It was a rule book for an ancient breakaway sect in the Middle East. And it took him a while to piece together what this was, but it turns out that in around the 8th century, some Karaites traveled from Cairo to the land of Israel. And they were poking around in some caves near Jericho, where they happened to come across some jars with some old papers in them, and they copied some of those papers down and brought them back to Cairo. Jars in caves near Jericho. Does that sound familiar to anyone? It should, because what they had found was the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, Solomon Schechter didn't know that this was from the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves hadn't really been discovered and wouldn't be discovered for another 50 years yet. But it turns out that some very early copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls were in the Genizah. This is a very small document. The original is probably about that size. And I should tell you, the most widely spoken language today amongst Jews is English, right? Most American, Canadian, and British Jews speak English. Most Israeli Jews speak English. That's like 80% of us right there. And there are certainly more than that. A century ago, believe it or not, the most widely spoken language amongst Jews was Arabic, often Judeo-Arabic, a Jewish variant of Arabic. That was also the case a millennium ago. So Arabic is the most widely represented language in the Genizah. There's also a lot of Hebrew in there. There's Persian, Judeo-Persian, there's Greek, Judeo-Greek. There was also a lot of correspondence between Cairo and India. And so this is a letter in some sort of an Indian language. What language is it in? You don't know? No, you probably don't know, because scholars have studied this little manuscript up, down, over, and under, and they haven't been able to figure it out. It's in some sort of a mystery language. They're pretty sure it's an Indian language of some sort, but it's not Hindi, and it's not one of the other big ones. So they really don't know what language it is in some sort of a mystery language. This is fascinating. These days, we have paper all over our homes. We paper our walls. We have books all over the place. We can go to the office supply store, get a ream of paper if we need it. But that often in the past wasn't always the case. And so it used to be that if you were a scribe and you wanted to write something out, you wouldn't have that fresh ream of paper to write on. And in that case, what would you do? Well, what you might do is take an already written on sheet of paper and erase it and write over it. But what you might not realize is that if that piece of paper got preserved somehow, like maybe I'm thinking in a Genizah or something, then over the years, over the ensuing centuries, the residue of the ink from the original writing on that piece of paper would undergo a reaction with the ambient air and at least start to come back. And what you'd be left with was a document with a darker, newer overcoat of text, and hovering behind it, often quite legibly, would be the remains, the legible remains of the original writing on that sheet of paper. We call these sheets of paper palimpsests. The word palimpsest comes from the Greek word meaning rescraped. And so here we see an example of this. From right to left here, you see a page of Talmud, actually 2 pages of Talmud, but then you can see perpendicular to that writing, the very discernible remains of a Greek psalm. The Talmud from the 11th century, the psalm, they believe, was written in around the 7th century. So what does that mean? It means that one day in the 1000s, a scribe wanted to write out some Talmud. What am I going to write this on? What am I going to write this on? Oh, here, I'll just use this old thing. He grabs a 400-year-old psalm, erases it, writes his Talmud over it, only to have that psalm come back as the Genizah sat over the centuries in the Genizah. There are dozens of these in the Genizah. This is not a page from the Cairo Genizah. This is a page that generations of American students, it's from a book that generations of American students, myself included, used to learn how to read Hebrew. I'm sure there are British equivalents of this. It's a children's reading primer. On the
And
right,
interestingly, the German, I learned from exactly this book, but in German.
oh, really? Oh, great. Okay. I didn't realize that there was a German version. So here on the right side, you have nonsense syllables, ba, 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 etc. On the left-hand side, you have stories. This is the shortest story in the book, all of 5 letters long. Ba, ba, daddy comes. How's that for character development and plot? It's great. But if you think, lest you think that it was only when this was originally published in the 1950s that these kinds of books started, you should look at the documents from the Cairo Genizah. And those of you who went to Cambridge might have been shown this document because it's so beautiful, but this is a children's reading primer. And sure enough, just as in the other one, over here you have e, ba, ba, be, be. Here you see, of course, a menorah and the stars of David. This is an 11th century document, they think. And it's one of the earliest examples of the 6-pointed star being used to decorate a Jewish document. They also have the children's writing exercises. You can see them writing out their olives, lines and lines of olives and bets, and you can see them doodling when they got bored. My son and I, who was 15 at the time, sat in Cambridge and looked at this, and I said, Jacob, can you believe that like 1,000 years from now, somebody's going to be sitting maybe and looking at your school papers halfway around the world from where you wrote them? And his grades in school went up a little bit after that. There's actually a swath of that document on the cover of my book. And when my book came out, my congregation had a launch party, and they had an image of my book on a sheet cake that they brought out. And I sent a picture of it to the people at Cambridge. I said, as far as I know, this is the first example of a rendering of a manuscript from the Cairo Genizah rendered in cake. And they said, yeah, and we don't see a credit to the Cambridge University Library in that cake. So I said it's on the inside. Now, a lot of very important people lived in Cambridge. It was a real, in Cairo, it was a real cultural and economic hub. One of the people who lived there was the great Rabbi Moses Maimonides. And so there's a lot of early Maimonides material here. Here you see a copy of his magnum opus, at least from a philosophical perspective, The Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim. What's notable about this page is that it's written out by hand, of course, by Maimonides himself. He had a very distinctive handwriting, and here it is. Replete with his own cross-outs, and other pages in this have marginal notations. Here to think that this great philosopher whom I've been studying since I was in high school, back in the 12th century when he lived, sat down at a piece of paper 800 years ago or whatever, and 900 years ago, and wrote out this piece of paper. And now I'm holding it in my hands. I can't tell you what a thrill that was. Now, the early generations of Genizah scholars studied mostly the literary manuscripts, the manuscripts that were made to look pretty and be read over and over again. But in the 1950s, this guy comes along, Shlomo Dov Goitein, born in Germany, moved to Israel in the 1920s, and then later to the United States, to Philadelphia, where he lived the rest of his life. And he spent about 35 years saying, you know what, show me everything else. And he spent these 35 years collecting this material into this magisterial 6-volume work called A Mediterranean Society, in which he answers questions like, for the Jews and really for the non-Jews also, because there were lots of close relations between Jews and non-Jews in Cairo back in the Middle Ages, you know, how were their homes laid out? What did their clothing look like? How did the beer taste? How long did it take a letter to get from point A to point B via the postal services? And he had this beautiful book, A Mediterranean Society, that he wrote about it. In the 50s, he was giving a talk at Jewish Theological Seminary in New York about some correspondence between India and Cairo that he had been studying from the Genizah. And during the Q&A, somebody raised his hand and said, you know, it'd be great if you had some correspondence between Maimonides and his brother. Now we know that the philosopher Moses Maimonides was very close with his younger brother, David Maimonides, a successful Egyptian merchant who died on a voyage who died at sea on a voyage to India. And when David died, it cast his older brother Moses into a deep depression from which it took him years to recover. And there was no correspondence between the two brothers that anybody knew of. So Goitein said, well, yeah, it would be great if I had that, but I can't make such a thing up. Well, the next week, he was in Cambridge, and he asked to see a box of manuscripts that nobody had really studied very closely yet. He reaches in blindly, and the first document that he pulls out was this, which turns out to be not only a letter from David Maimonides to his older brother Moses, but in all likelihood, the very last letter that the two brothers exchanged. It's from Aidab, a port city on the Red Sea. And David writes to Moses and he said, I've had a harrowing time to get to this point. I was trying to get some goods to trade, to sell from here, but there isn't much here. I'm going to get on a boat. I'm going to go to India, but God willing, I'll be back soon. God willing, we'll see one another soon. I know. He said, I miss you very much. I know you miss me. Again, God willing, we'll see one another soon. He posts this letter, and a few hours, maybe a few days afterwards, he gets on a boat and is never seen again. Now, the experts in these things will say that the holes in the paper come from the ravages of age. As I suggest in my book, I wonder if instead they might come from the tears of a grieving brother. Do you know what this is? Somebody, in another talk I gave, somebody said they thought it might be matzah, but it's not. This is, if you were going to say sheet music, you would have been correct. As a matter of fact, this is the oldest piece of sheet music, of Jewish sheet music, known to exist in the world. It was written by a man named Ovadia Hager, Obadiah the convert. Ovadia Hager was born in Italy. He became a Catholic monk. And in 1096, he saw the horrors of the First Crusade and was so mortified that he converted to Judaism, whereupon he had to flee Italy. He eventually made his way to Cairo, where he wrote this music. The music itself is Gregorian chant. The words are a Hebrew eulogy for Moses. They sat silent in the Genizah for 800 years, and now we can hear them again. Who, like Moses, stood with thee on Mount Horeb, a matter of listening it was. It goes on from there. Now, remember, the documents only made their way into the Genizah if they were damaged or destroyed somehow. So here it makes them very difficult to study. So here we have front and back of the same piece of paper, two letters, one on each side, from Fustat to Kairouan, from around 1039 CE. They were found in Cambridge University, first published by a professor in my alma mater, Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. It was about some sort of an international Jewish political controversy. You see, this was back in the days when different groups of Jews used to argue with one another about matters of Jewish religious practice and belief. Thank God that's in the past. It had to do with the academies of Babylonia and the land of Israel and sages in Kairouan, which is in modern day Tunisia and Yemen. It was very complicated. And Jacob Mann, who found this, couldn't really make much sense of it, because really it turns out that all he had here was the bottom half of the piece of paper. Over the centuries somehow, in the crush and crunch of the Genizah, the top half had gotten torn off. And so it was hard to piece together what this letter was all about. Similarly, in the 70s, this document was found at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. This too is front and back of one sheet of paper, written around the same time as the other one, about some sort of an international Jewish political controversy. Only this scholar at first had trouble making sense of it, because all he had was the top half of the sheet of paper. The bottom half had gotten torn off. And you can probably see where this is going. He got a tip about this other document in Cambridge, put the two together, found out they fit perfectly, and all of a sudden the document made sense. Nowadays, starting in the 90s, they put together, there was a philanthropist in Toronto named Dov Friedberg, who financed an effort to put together the first worldwide catalog of these documents. Most of them are in Cambridge now, but a good number are in New York, and there are many others scattered all over the United States, Israel, and Europe. So now we have a catalog of these, and they've taught the computer how to look at these documents, how to read the size, the shape, the color, the handwriting, and put together these joins. And they've identified in a relatively short period of time thousands of these joins as the computer tries to reassemble this worldwide jigsaw puzzle of manuscripts from the Cairo Genizah. Here's a page from their website. You need a password to get on. I've got one. And at the very least, the website allows you to zoom on these documents. And so you can zoom into, it gets pixelated eventually, but you can zoom into one word. And here we have the word echad, meaning one, of course. And you can see how even that little function allows these documents to be so much more accessible. And here you see in an office building in downtown Jerusalem, the modern home of the Cairo Genizah. Interestingly, the people who originally saved the documents, they wanted to hold on to the physical documents. They just didn't ever care to read them again. Nowadays, with the help of this computer, we can all read them again. We just can't get at the physical documents. So I'm aware of the time, but I want to share about my trip, because as I was studying this, I realized that if I'm going to write a book about the Genizah, I should probably see the Genizah. Well, I didn't realize how difficult that was going to be. It took me literally hundreds of emails all over the world before I finally got permission from the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Egypt to see the Cairo Genizah. At the time, I thought that nobody had been in the Genizah since the last documents were taken out of it back in 1911. This is now 2010. So I thought that nobody had been in there, no outsiders at least, for 99 years. It turns out a few people had, but not many. And I don't believe any rabbis had been in there since Solomon Schechter was there in the 1890s. So I finally got permission to go. I decided I would stop in Cambridge along the way to see some Genizah sites and meet some Genizah people, and stop in New York on the way home to do the same thing. My son, who was 15 years old at the time, insisted on coming along with me. And in February 2010, Expedition Genizah began. That was me with more hair. We had some fun here. So we had our little logo made. We had to put on T-shirts, and there we go. And in February 2010, we went to the airport, and off we went. So the first stop was in Cambridge. Now, I share this with American audiences and Canadian audiences, and it feels far more foreign to them. But you can imagine how lonely Schechter, as the only Jewish faculty member at Cambridge, must have felt in these kinds of surroundings. We went to Castlebrae, and the dining room where Schechter identified that first Ben Ezra document, is now the office of the dorm manager. You can see the fireplace from the Giblu's time. Their furniture.
I used to live just opposite. I was
Really?
a student at Clare, so I lived literally just
right
opposite
there.
Castlebrae.
Yes, and now, and little did you know, perhaps, what happened there. The Giblu's furniture is still in some of the dorm rooms now, with the wet towels and the underwear of the students hanging from it. And this was Schechter's house. That door is that blue door is the one he burst through. Wife, as long as the Bible lives, my name shall not die. The library is hardly the most beautiful building in Cambridge, but and some of you I know went there. There's a small warren of offices that is the home of the Cairo, the Taylor Schechter Genizah Research Unit. This is Dr. Ben Ezra, a non-Jewish guy actually, who knows all these languages. And I don't know if you met him there, but he's the head man in charge. Now usually when you visit these research libraries, you have to get, if you have the right credentials, you can get into the manuscript reading room. We got into the back rooms where they were restoring some of these documents at a rate of about 4 per day, very painstaking work. And we got into the manuscript storage room. As we're walking back there, Jacob, my son, elbows me. He said, Dad, that was the Darwin aisle. It's in the same room where the Genizah manuscripts are stored that like Charles Darwin's, the original Beagle diaries are stored. Isaac Newton's papers are in the same room as well. And this and 1.5 more aisles like it is the current home of the largest collection of antiquarian Jewish manuscripts in the world. Here, they didn't throw anything away. Here we have the dust and flakes that fell to the bottom of the boxes as they got the shipments from Cairo. From Cambridge, we went to Cairo. Now, as we were making arrangements, I got an email from a woman who grew up in Cairo and said, Rabbi Glickman, she lives in Israel now. She said, Rabbi Glickman, you need to be very careful there. There are going to be people who won't want you to get into the Genizah. They're going to try to prevent it from happening. You will be under constant government surveillance from the moment you arrive. You must be very discreet when you're there. Be very careful, but you're going to have a great time. And so we didn't quite know what to expect. It did look like they were expecting us at the airport. We got waved through a lot of otherwise long lines. And this was about a year to the day before the balloon went up in Cairo, if you know what I mean, before the Arab Spring hit Cairo. But it was very definitely, there was a strong police presence there. We hired a guide and a driver with a 9-person vehicle, 2 people, with a vehicle, $180 for 3 days. It was great. We said we wanted, she was a very knowledgeable archaeologist. We said we want to see the first day we want to see the pyramids, the Egypt Museum, it's the Cairo Museum, fine. The next day we need to go to Fustat, fine, and to the Ben Ezra Synagogue, fine. And we made arrangements to see the Genizah. She said, oh no, you can't see the Genizah. The Genizah is off limits. I said, but I have a letter here from the director of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, Dr. Zahi Hawass, who happens to be her boss's boss. This is a cabinet level position in Egypt. And she said, Dr. Zahi Hawass? And the discussion was over right then and there. Dr. Hawass had told me that an associate of his would meet me there, but an archaeologist friend of mine said, you could get there and he'll be on vacation. You really need to be, to be certain that this is going to work. And I called the guy ahead of time and said, yeah, I'll be there. What synagogue was it again? He didn't set me at ease very much. But we saw the sites the first day. And the next day, we went into Fustat, immediately saw signs for the Ben Ezra Synagogue, saw that it looked just like it does in pictures, as you can see. And we went right in. Jacob loved taking this picture. Originally, sure enough, the guy from the Supreme Council of Antiquities wasn't there. Eventually, he showed up with a whole entourage. They gave us basically a motorcade in Cairo that day with police escort and everything. There were people from the Supreme Council of Antiquities, people from the synagogue, police officers assigned to guarantee us our security, all kinds of other people we didn't know who they were, but we had this whole entourage. The guy from the Supreme Council of Antiquities, Mr. Mustafa, went to the caretakers, said, this is Rabbi Glickman, he's from America. That's where I lived at the time. He's a very important man. He's come to see the Genizah. They nodded their heads. They showed me outside. I knew why. We went outside, up the outside staircase, into the door on the side of the building. We got our first glimpse of the Genizah. We turned left, made a couple of rights. Soon we're standing right underneath. Now, what I'm about to do is to show you a film of what happened when I climbed to see the Genizah. Again, we thought at the time nobody had been in there in 99 years. Very few people had. The camera, it was in this moment that I had the biggest surprise of the whole trip. On this video that you're going to see, it's about 2 minutes long. I announced the surprise the moment before the memory card on the camera ran out. So you'll see the big surprise and then it ends. Beforehand, I was wondering, what am I going to say when I first step in there? The first person there in 99 years. One small step for a rabbi, one giant leap. I don't know. My father said I should say, Jimmy Hoffa, Amelia Earhart, there you are. But so here's what happens. Oh, and I should also say, what you don't get a sense of is the tension of this moment. We're on the balcony. It's about 30 or 40 feet down to the floor on the side. And there are all these people behind the camera that you can't see. Okay? So here we go. Once this guy here, you'll get a hint of surprise. Can I go in? Yes, outside. Did you see what he did? I can't see anything there. There's a floor in there. So can you jump without touching the walls? Without touching the walls? Yeah. I'm not going to let you stop me now. I got this far. You mean without touching this? No, just like oh. You can put your leg here. Do you have a higher ladder? No. There's nobody. Nobody ever just for taking a look. I remember I have a flashlight. Just 1 minute. We'll bring another. Are we? You can bring another one. There's no floor. Now, as it turns out, there was a floor, of course, but for some reason, in all my years of research on this, I thought that the floor was there, right? Maybe there. Oh no, it was down about 25 feet. If I had jumped in there, like my friend Mr. Mustafa was suggesting, I don't think he was trying to kill me. He didn't know, but wouldn't that have been a story? And there were no pictures because the Giblus had forgotten to bring their cameras that day, remember? So in any event, we got a new ladder there eventually. Wait a minute. why am I not? Hang on a second. Let me just get to my next frame here. Sorry about this. Wait a minute. There. So that this we call the. I'm sorry. Hang on a second. We call this the famous Tuchus picture, and wait a minute but that we had completed the journey here. Now I don't have a Zoom screen right now, so and here you see the first picture ever
I think
taken.
we can't see it on the share anymore.
You can't. Oh, let me share. I'm sorry. Hang
No,
on a
that's okay.
second. There. Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
So here we see we have the first picture ever taken of the Cairo Genizah. The bags in the bottom are labeled salt, which a friend of mine suggested might have stood for sacred ancient literary treasures, but probably just stood for salt, thrown in there, we think, during the 90s to keep the room dry. From Cairo, now I went to New York. I met there with Rabbi John Schechter, the great grandson of Rabbi Solomon Schechter, who, as we talked, we realized we grew up about 3 miles from each other, and he was my camp counselor in the 1970s. And he's showing us some of the heirlooms there. JTS has about 30 to 40,000 manuscripts. They're restoring some of them there at Jewish Theological Seminary. Here we are paging through a Passover Haggadah, one of the 2 oldest known Passover Haggadahs in the world. This is so old, there are only 2 questions in it, to give you a sense of its age. Dates back to about the year 1000. We went to Seattle. That's actually our departure picture. We were so tired when we got back. I'll end. Oh, and here's my book, really on some manuscript from the Cairo Genizah that they took at Cambridge. What I'll do, I'm going to stop the share here. Am I still sharing my screen?
No, we can see you full screen.
So let me just end with one comment here. And I mean, I could say a lot more, but after this happens, after Schechter comes back to the United States, he studies the Genizah manuscript for about 5 years, and then he's brought to New York, 1903, to become the head of the newly reorganized Jewish Theological Seminary there. During his inaugural gala, he gives a speech to the assembled throngs in their black ties and tails, and he talks about his research into the Genizah manuscripts. And he said that to study an old manuscript is to perform what he called an act of resurrection in miniature. You study these little scraps of paper, and something from someone many centuries ago, halfway around the world, can come alive again. And it's the thrill of performing these countless acts of resurrection in miniature that, for me, makes it such a joy to study these manuscripts and to study the story of the Cairo Genizah, and makes it such a joy to share it with you as well. I've gone on for a long time now. I don't know how much time we have for questions, but I thank you for the opportunity to share this story with you and to be with you this evening.
Thank you so much. Really, really big thank you. I think, 1 second, I'm going to take the spotlight of you and put us all on gallery view so everyone can show their appreciation. Really, really fascinating. I think if people still have time and are not too tired yet, and if you, Rabbi Glickman, have more time, then I'm very happy to stay on for a little bit longer and give people the opportunity to talk. I think for me it was really wonderful. What a wonderful introduction, and it was a sort of. I had never really thought. I had heard many things about the story of the Genizah and visited when I was a student in Cambridge, also the collection, but nobody had ever mentioned the connection about Castlebrae, and I lived there for 2 years of my life, literally just, it was part of the Porter's Lodge. I had a friend who lived above that dining room,
Oh,
actually,
that's
probably
great.
with the furniture. I don't know. I need
That's
to now
great.
check back on my old pictures. But so thank you so much. I want to give people the opportunity to ask questions, make comments. I can see Michael's got his hand up, so we're going to give Michael a chance. Um, as we want to give lots of people the chance to speak, if you can try to keep your comments brief, that would be fabulous, and ideally be questions. That would be fantastic. Thank you, Michael, and then
Right.
Sybil.
Good evening, Mark. I'm just saying, what was the connection between Schechter and Neubauer, who was actually resident in Oxford at that particular time?
Schechter and who?
Neubauer,
Oh,
who was it?
Neubauer. Yes. Well,
Yeah.
so Neubauer was one of the librarians at. Oh wait a minute, I believe he was at the Bodleian at the time.
Yeah.
And so he was. Remember, I said that that they found some after Schechter came out with his announcement about the Ben Sira. It was Neubauer's guys that found the Ben Sira manuscript there, and he had worked with that shady Austrian count, sort of behind Schechter's back, in order to get some of the Genizah manuscripts out from under Schechter's hands while Schechter was there working in Cambridge. And there's a long, fascinating story there that you got to read the book to hear about.
Wonderful, thank you. I've got Sybil next. If you also have a question, if you put up your hand, then I will go to you next. But Sybil, over to you.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you, were there any other manuscripts there other than religious ones? Were there any? Yes.
Yes, there were many, because a lot of people ask, why were non-religious secular manuscripts there? And well, just to give you the short answer to your question, there were court documents, there were business records, there were love letters. I mean, think of your own life and all the papers that you generate just in your daily life. They were all there, and it's for a few reasons. First of all, the idea of what constitutes a sacred document has sort of waxed and waned over the years. This was such a literary society that they considered really all writing to be somehow sacred, somehow special. So they held on to it. Plus, because of the etiquette in Arabic speaking countries at the time, there was a lot more God talk. If I was writing Sybil a note to you, I might say to my good friend Sybil, may God's blood blessing be upon you, blah, 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 blah. And therefore God's name would have been on that document. And therefore it's a religious document. Yes. And plus there was just so much of this stuff. So we can picture a situation in which grandpa dies and he's got a big pile of papers and the grandchildren are going through these and probably saying some of these are religious, some of these should probably go into Genizah, but not all of them. Do you want to go through all these and figure out which ones need to go there? I sure don't. No, I don't want to do it. You do it. I don't. And they eventually just would dump them all into the Genizah. So for a lot of reasons, there were all kinds of things in the Genizah.
Oh, it's fascinating. Thank you very much, Rabbi Glickman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I saw that somebody made a comment about the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are about 1,000 or so Dead Sea Scrolls. There are about 300,000 or so Genizah manuscripts. For Jews especially, the Genizah is a far more significant find. The Dead Sea Scrolls didn't know about Talmud. They didn't know about rabbinic literature. It's the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they are seen by some as perhaps being proto-Christian. They have about 1 billion interested viewers, and they get all the fancy museums and expensive tours. Dead Sea Scrolls this, Dead Sea Scrolls that. Not so much with the Genizah, but I'm doing everything I can to correct that.
Well, you definitely have a captive audience here, and I think everyone shares your excitement. David, I think.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
First of all, thank you very much indeed for that absolutely wonderful and fascinating talk. How many of the fragments have yet to be translated?
The vast majority of them. I mean, some of them have been translated. The first step is to transcribe them. just get electronic copies of the text in the original, and then translate them. So only, I don't know percentage. If I had to guess, I would guess that maybe 10% have been translated into English. A lot of them are in Arabic or Judeo-Arabic, and so there's not. It takes an army of people to translate these, but it's happening slowly but surely.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? I know, John, John Sable, this is, I know you saw the letter from Maimonides, right? That we heard about.
A number of years ago, I was one of the party who went there, and I described to you, Rabbi Lehr, the experience that I had in seeing that letter. And when I was actually there, it didn't mean much initially. It was just an old letter. And then I'm sitting on the train home, and I almost felt myself just exploding with this amazing thought. I touched this letter. It's however old it is, to Maimonides. Maimonides seems, and I just, for the next week, I kept getting bigger and bigger, so to speak, in my mind, the enormity of what I'd touched and seen. And Rabbi Glickman, you mentioned how you felt, and it was exactly how I felt on seeing that document. Just astonishing.
So I'm so glad you shared that experience. And there's a movie, Backdraft, I think it was called, about where Donald Sutherland plays an old arsonist, an old pyromaniac, who says, who's talking to a young arsonist at one point and said, "Did the fire talk to you? Did you feel it? Did you feel it?" And so now I feel like we share that bond, hopefully in a less creepy way. But yes, exactly. That it's such a thrill because we have a direct physical connection with this medieval world. And a lot of us in our perception of Jewish history, we sort of jump from the early 20th century back to the biblical times. But this is the link that connects those two together. So yeah, so I'm so glad you had that thrill, as did I, and it's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Natalie.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, because that question has been asked in a comment, but hasn't been answered yet. Is the Genizah really that empty? Because it looked like when you filmed it, that there was almost nothing left in there.
Well, so there were a lot of things in there, but the last documents got brought out in 1911, and actually they sat in a trunk of a family named Moseri, which comes from the word Mitzri, Egyptian, and they sat there until about 10 or 15 years ago in Paris, and then they were finally brought to Cambridge, where I saw them being processed. So those were the last documents that got taken out of there. Egypt, of course, is very touchy about these, outsiders from the West coming and getting their hands on their antiquities. So I have a feeling that if there were still antiquities in there, they wouldn't have let me in. And I was only able to get there because now it's an empty room. And so it is an empty room except for those couple bags of salt.
It's not being used anymore.
Excuse me?
It's not used anymore. They don't
I know that there's somebody here who grew up in Cairo. Even as recently as getting into the mid 20th century, there were tens of thousands of Jews in Cairo, but now there's just a very small handful of very elderly Jews who live there. They have one synagogue that's still being used elsewhere in the city, several others that are being either maintained or not maintained by the government. But this is a tourist attraction, but not a working synagogue anymore.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Glickman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments or?
It's lovely.
Well, I think in that case, we're going to say a big thank you again, Rabbi Glickman. It really was absolutely, absolutely fabulous. And I can see from all the comments, everyone is writing their praise. And
oh well, thank you so much. It's really a joy to be with you, and I'm so I find it so encouraging to to hear of your interest in the Genizah and its wonderful story and the treasures that it contained. And I thank you for the opportunity to be with you this evening and to share what I did with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And for everyone, we have 2 more weeks, so we're going to look next week at liturgy, and especially how some of the findings from the Genizah have found their way into progressive liturgies around the world. And then we will look in our last session, we'll look at the ordinary documents. So at the things that we wouldn't necessarily define as the sacred text. So that was one of your questions, Sybil. So that will be our last session. Although you've now discovered how much there is, so if we all feel really enthusiastic, we can always pick up the story again after Pesach and do more, because if we are all enjoying it, why shouldn't we learn more? So thank you to all of you for coming and joining us. And again, thank you so much to Rabbi Glickman for being with us. Really, thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night. Laila Tov, everyone.
Shana Tov.
Laila Tov.